I found out my online Mexican girlfriend has a husband and kids after sending her 60,000. My name is Dave. I'm 65 years old, American, retired, and until recently, I believed I was the kind of man who didn't make foolish mistakes. I spent most of my adult life doing things the sensible way. I worked for over 40 years as a logistics supervisor in Ohio. Not a glamorous career, but a stable one. I showed up on time, paid my taxes, contributed to my retirement accounts, and avoided risks that didn't make sense on paper. I married once, divorced quietly in my early 50s, and never remarried. No children, no drama, just a steady life that ran like a well-managed spreadsheet. When I retired, I thought I'd earned some peace. I sold my townhouse, consolidated my accounts, and ended up with just over $300,000 in savings, plus a modest pension that covered my basic monthly expenses. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable, careful, secure. What I wasn't was prepared for the silence. The first year after retirement felt fine. I stayed busy. Gym in the mornings, errands, the occasional lunch with former coworkers who were still half alive from spreadsheets and deadlines. But slowly, the days stretched longer. Calls came less often. Evenings started blending together. That's when Mexico entered my life, not as a fantasy, but as a solution. Lower cost of living, mild climate, walkable cities, a place where my money would last longer and my days wouldn't feel like an endless loop of television and reheated dinners. I didn't want nightlife or chaos. I wanted normal life with a little color in it. I chose Querétaro because it felt balanced. Clean streets, families out at night, parks filled with noise that wasn't threatening, kids, dogs, conversations. I rented a modest apartment near the historic center, 2 bedrooms, nothing flashy. Just enough space to breathe. For the first few months, I told myself I was happy. New food, new routines, Spanish lessons I half kept up with, long walks in the evenings. I liked that no one knew my history. I liked that my age didn't define me the way it had back home. But here's the truth I didn't want to admit. You don't leave loneliness behind by crossing a border. You just give it new scenery. I ate most of my meals alone. I watched couples laugh across cafe tables. I passed families strolling together at night and felt like an extra in someone else's life. I tried expat meetups, but the conversations always felt hollow money talk, visa talk, complaints, everyone pretending they were doing better than they were. I told myself I didn't need anyone. That's when Maria messaged me. It was a comment on Facebook, of all things. I posted a photo of Peña de Bernal after a day trip. She replied in English, saying she liked my picture and hoped I was enjoying Mexico. Her profile showed a young Mexican woman, dark hair, warm smile, photos with family, posts going back years. Nothing flashy, nothing suspicious. I hesitated before replying. She was 26. I wasn't blind to the age gap. I'd read the warnings, seen the stories, but something about her profile felt grounded, real, and she wasn't asking for anything. We started talking casually, where I was from, why I moved, what she did for work. She told me she lived outside the city, helped her family, sold handmade goods online, and occasionally worked at a local shop. Her English wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful. She asked questions, remembered details. That mattered more than I realized at the time. Within a week, we were talking daily. Good morning messages, voice notes, short video calls in the evenings. She'd show me her town, the dusty roads, the small houses, her mother cooking in the background. It felt intimate without being sexual, emotional without being heavy. She called me Dave Cariño, said I was calm, patient, different from other men. And after years of feeling invisible, those words landed deep. 2 months in, I realized my phone had become the highlight of my day. I'd structure errands around her schedule. Look forward to her messages more than anything else. I told myself this was just connection, human connection, and that I deserved it. I flew to Mexico City and took a bus to meet her in person. Standing there outside the station waiting, I felt ridiculous. 65 years old, heart pounding like a teenager, telling myself to stay grounded. Then she appeared. She smiled when she saw me, wide, genuine, and walked straight into my arms, hugged me tightly, like she'd been waiting just as long. People passed around us, and I didn't care. We spent 6 days together. She introduced me as her boyfriend, held my hand everywhere, showed me local food spots, sat close to me in cafes, looked at me when I talked, not through me, not distracted, but like my words mattered. The intimacy came naturally, no rush, no awkwardness. For the first time in years, I felt wanted, not tolerated. Before I left, I gave her about $250 for travel and missed work. She cried when I handed it to her, told me no one had ever helped her like that, called me her blessing. I flew back to Querétaro floating. That's when the request began. Small at first. Always wrapped in apology. Her mother needed medicine. Her younger brother's school registration came earlier than expected. Her phone cracked, and she needed it for work. The amounts were modest. 60 here, 1 there. I didn't hesitate. I could afford it. And she was always grateful. Always embarrassed to ask. Always promising it wouldn't become a habit. By late summer, I'd sent around 6,000. Then came the message that changed everything. A late-night voice note. Maria crying. Her uncle, the one who helped run the family operation, had been injured. The small delivery van they relied on was breaking down. Without it, they couldn't transport goods. They would lose contracts, lose income. She sent photos, a mechanic's estimate, videos of family members explaining the situation. The amount needed was $14,000. I didn't sleep that night. I paced my apartment, running numbers, telling myself this wasn't charity, it was an investment. If they stabilized, the request would stop. She'd be secure. We'd build a future. When I told her I'd help, she sobbed uncontrollably, called me her miracle, told me she wanted to marry me someday. I sent the money. And just like that, my role in her life shifted from boyfriend to provider. I didn't realize it yet. I just knew that I felt needed, important, alive. And that feeling would end up costing me far more than money. After I sent the money for the van, I expected things to settle down. In my mind, this was the turning point. The big hurdle that, once cleared, would allow Maria's life to stabilize. No more emergencies, no more late-night panic calls, just two people building something slowly, responsibly. That's how I justified it to myself. For the first couple of weeks, everything felt right again. Maria sent photos of the van parked outside a small house. She showed me her uncle smiling, her mother hugging her, her younger siblings waving awkwardly at the camera. She called me every night, her voice warm, affectionate, grateful. You changed everything for us, she said more than once. I don't know how to thank you. One day, I will be your wife, I promise. I saved those messages, literally. Screenshots, voice notes. I replayed them when the apartment felt too quiet. Back then, my savings had dropped to around $210,000. Still comfortable, still safe. I told myself I'd simply accelerated a future expense, that people spend far more than that on second homes or failed businesses. This wasn't recklessness. It was love with a practical component. That's what I told myself. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic began to change. Maria was still affectionate, but the intensity dulled. Video calls that used to last an hour now ended after 20 minutes. Sometimes she'd be distracted, glancing off screen. When I asked what she was doing, she'd smile and say, "Just family things. I didn't push. I didn't want to seem controlling. I reminded myself that she was busy now. The van had created work, responsibility. A good problem," she'd said. Then came the next request. Not framed as an emergency this time, framed as logic. "Dave," she said one evening, serious but calm, "the van is helping, but fuel is expensive. Maintenance too. Sometimes we struggle before deliveries pay." She paused, waiting. "If we had a little buffer," she continued, "just until things balance, it would make everything smoother." She wasn't asking for a specific amount. That should have been a warning sign. Instead, it felt considerate. I sent $3,000. After that, the request found a rhythm. A repair here, a permit there, unexpected fees that only exist in Mexico. Each amount was just small enough not to alarm me, but frequent enough to become normal. By the end of the year, I realized I'd sent another $12,000 without ever sitting down and adding it up. What kept me calm was Maria's tone. She never demanded, never guilted, never threatened. She always asked softly with explanations that made sense in isolation, and every time I hesitated, even for a second, she'd pull back emotionally. Messages shorter, less warmth, less affection. I didn't notice the pattern consciously at first. I just knew that when I helped, things felt good again. Around Christmas, I sent her $500 as a gift. I expected a call, a video message, something. Instead, I got a text. "Thank you, Dave." No heart emojis, no photo, no call. I stared at my phone longer than I'd like to admit. January was worse. Calls dropped to once or twice a week. Always rushed, always interrupted. She said the van kept them busy, that her family relied on her more now, that she was exhausted. I checked her Facebook obsessively. She was active, posting photos, sharing memes, reacting to comments, just not talking to me. One photo stopped me cold. Maria, dressed nicely, standing beside the van, a man next to her, arm casually resting on the hood. The caption mentioned, "Family business growing." I asked who he was. "My cousin," she replied quickly. "He helps drive sometimes, has license." It made sense. It made sense. Too much sense. I hated myself for feeling jealous. I reminded myself that I was 65, living alone in a rented apartment while she had an entire family network. Of course I wasn't the center of her world. Still, the unease settled in my chest like a weight. By February, my savings were down to about $145,000. That number scared me when I finally forced myself to look at it. I hadn't planned to touch that much so quickly. My pension covered my living expenses, yes, but this wasn't sustainable, not long term. I told myself I needed clarity. One evening, I tried to talk to her about boundaries, about slowing down, about planning. She didn't argue, she just went quiet. "You don't want to help anymore?" she asked softly. "That's not what I said," I replied. "I just need to understand where this is going." There was a long pause. "I thought you cared about me," she said. That sentence did more damage than any accusation could have. Of course I cared. That was the problem. After that conversation, the emotional distance grew wider. When we spoke, it felt scripted, obligatory. like she was fulfilling a role rather than wanting to be there. So I made a decision that, in hindsight, was both desperate and foolish. I would visit her again, not planned, not announced weeks in advance. I'd surprise her, remind her of what we had in person, of the connection, the warmth, the reality that existed outside of screens and transfers. I booked a flight for March. 10 days! I didn't tell her until I was already in Mexico City. Surprise, I messaged. I'm here! Hours passed before she replied. Why you didn't tell me? I'm not ready. I'm very busy. The excitement I expected wasn't there. Eventually, she agreed to see me the next evening. When she arrived at the hotel, she looked different, not worse, just distant. She hugged me, but lightly, like you hug a relative you haven't seen in a while. She called me Dave, not Cariño. Over the next few days, she stayed with me on and off. The intimacy felt forced, mechanical, like something she was performing out of obligation rather than desire. When we lay together afterward, she'd turn away immediately, scrolling on her phone. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself I was overthinking. On the 8th night, I asked if we could visit her family, see the van, meet everyone properly. Her face went pale. No, she said quickly. It's not good time. Too much stress. That was the moment my unease turned into dread. That night, while she was in the bathroom, her phone buzzed on the bedside table. The message was in English. Did he leave yet? The kids are asking about you. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it. I didn't want to look, but I did. And what I found would unravel everything I thought I knew about Maria and about myself. I shouldn't have touched her phone. I know that now. I knew it then. But there are moments when your body moves before your morals catch up, and this was one of them. The screen was still lit. The message sat there, undeniable. Did he leave yet? The kids are asking about you. Kids! Plural. My hands started shaking so badly I had to sit down. My first instinct was that I'd misunderstood, that it was a mistranslation, a joke, something taken out of context. I wanted there to be an explanation so badly that my chest hurt. I scrolled. I shouldn't have, but I did. The conversation was long, weeks long, months maybe, a man named Carlos. The tone wasn't flirtatious. It was familiar, domestic, the kind of shorthand people develop when they built a life together. Don't forget diapers. Your mom called. He misses you. I'll be home soon. Then the line that finally broke whatever was holding me together. Just 2 more days. The foreigner is leaving soon. Foreigner. Not my name, not Dave, just a role. The bathroom door opened. Maria stepped out, wrapped in the hotel robe, drying her hair with a towel. She saw me sitting on the bed, saw her phone in my hands. She froze. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. No shouting, no panic, just silence stretching thin and sharp between us. Who is Carlos? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. She walked over, took the phone from my hands, glanced at the screen, and sighed. Not panicked, not guilty, tired. You shouldn't read my messages, she said. That was it. No denial, no explanation, just irritation, like I'd violated her privacy rather than uncovered the truth. Who are the kids? I asked, my voice barely steady. She sat down on the edge of the bed and rubbed her temples. Okay, she said finally, we need to talk. I laughed then, a short, hollow sound that didn't feel like it came from me. Yes, I said, I think we do. She looked at me, really looked at me, like she was assessing how much effort this conversation was worth. Then she said it. I have a family, Dave. The words landed with a dull thud, like something heavy dropped into deep water. A husband, she continued, and 2 children. I stared at her. How old? I asked, though I already knew the answer would hurt. 5 and 3. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a belt around it and started pulling. And Carlos? I asked. She nodded. My husband. I stood up and walked toward the window. The city lights below blurred together, bright and indifferent. You told me he was your cousin, I said. He is family, she replied. Just not the way you thought. I turned back to her. So everything, I asked. The farm, the van, your parents. All real, she said calmly. Just not mine. His family's. I felt sick. You let me believe, I started. I didn't lie, she interrupted. I just didn't tell you everything. I laughed again, louder this time, bitter. That's called lying, she shrugged. We needed money, she said. Carlos works construction. Not steady, 2 children. We were drowning. And you decided I was the solution, I said. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and something hardened in her eyes. You were lonely, she said. You had money. You wanted to help someone. You wanted to feel important. That's not. No one forced you, she said firmly. You sent money because you wanted to, because it made you feel good. Each word felt like it was being pressed into a bruise. You told me you loved me, I said. She hesitated. I cared about you, she said finally. You were kind. You listened. But love. She shook her head gently. Dave, you are 65. I'm 26. I sat back down heavily. You talked about marriage, I said. I listened, she replied. You talked. I didn't promise. The future we were building, she sighed. It helped my family, she said. Nothing was wasted. I felt something crack inside me then, not heartbreak, not anger, but a kind of cold clarity. So what was I to you? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, you were help. That was it. Not a partner, not a lover. Help. I stood up again. Get out, I said. She blinked. What? Get out, I repeated. Now. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She calmly got up, went to the dresser, and started packing her things like she'd rehearsed this moment. As she zipped her bag, she looked at me. I'm sorry you're hurt, she said, but you wanted this. No, I said, I wanted you. She shook her head slowly. You wanted how I made you feel, she said. That's different. She paused at the door. One more thing, she added. I didn't look at her. You shouldn't come here again, she said. This was never real life. Then she left. The door clicked shut behind her, soft and final. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. Eventually, I picked up my phone and opened my bank app. The number stared back at me, indifferent and unforgiving. Between the van, the transfers, the help, and the last-minute expenses of this trip, I had sent just over $60,000. Gone, not stolen in one dramatic moment. Given away, piece by piece, because I wanted to matter. The worst part wasn't the money. It was realizing that every affectionate message, every promise, every soft word had been calculated, not maliciously, not cruelly, but practically. Survival wrapped in romance. I slept alone that night. The next morning, I booked the earliest flight home. I didn't message Maria. I didn't block her either. I didn't need to, because whatever illusion I'd been living in had already collapsed. And I knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in my bones, that this wasn't the end of the damage. It was just the moment I finally understood how deep it went. Flying home felt like retreating from a battlefield I didn't know I'd been fighting on. The airport was loud and ordinary in the way places are when your life is falling apart, but the rest of the world hasn't gotten the memo. Families argued about luggage. Couples complained about delays. A child cried over a dropped toy. I stood in line with my backpack and my carry-on, feeling like I'd aged 10 years in a week. On the plane, I didn't sleep. I stared at the seatback screen without turning it on, replaying everything in my head, searching for the moment where I could have stopped it. Where I could have said no. Where I could have asked one question that would have cracked the whole thing open earlier. There wasn't one. That's what hurt the most. This wasn't a single bad decision. It was a chain of reasonable ones. Help with school fees, help with medicine, help with equipment, help with a van that would change their lives. Each step made sense on its own. It was only when you zoomed out that you could see the shape of the trap. When I landed back in England, the cold hit me like an accusation. Gray sky, wet pavement. The same streets I'd walked for years, suddenly unfamiliar. I unlocked my front door and stepped into a flat that felt smaller than I remembered. Quieter. Too quiet. The first thing I did wasn't unpack. It was open my laptop. I needed to know. I needed to see the damage clearly, like naming an injury before you can treat it. I logged into every account. Bank statements, transfer histories, emails, screenshots she'd sent me, photos I'd saved, because they made me feel connected to something bigger than myself. I added everything up slowly, methodically, like I was back at work measuring costs on a job site. School fees, medical bills, emergency transfers, the van, fuel, repairs, unexpected costs. The total settled just north of $60,000. Seeing it written down didn't make it feel real. It just made it heavier. That money wasn't excess. It wasn't spare change. It was security. It was future medical care. It was comfort. It was the buffer between dignity and panic. Gone. I sat there until my tea went cold, staring at the final number, waiting for some kind of emotional explosion that never came. No screaming, no tears, just emptiness. The days that followed blurred together. Friends noticed something was wrong. Kevin from the pub asked why I disappeared. Why I wasn't answering messages. Why I looked like I hadn't slept. I lied. Just tired, I said. Travel wore me out. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud, not yet. Saying it would make it real in a way numbers on a screen hadn't. When I finally did tell Kevin, it came out in fragments. Pieces of the story scattered across an afternoon pint. He listened quietly, didn't interrupt, didn't laugh, didn't say, I told you so. When I finished, he just shook his head slowly. You weren't stupid, he said. You were lonely. That sentence hit harder than any insult could have. Because it was true. Loneliness had been the constant background noise of my life for years. Divorce had taken routine. Retirement had taken purpose. Time had stretched out endlessly, and I'd filled it with distractions that never quite reached the quiet ache underneath. Maria didn't create that loneliness. She exploited it. There's a difference, but it took me a long time to see it. I tried reporting what happened. Out of desperation more than hope, I contacted my bank. They sympathized, but the answer was the same every time. Sir, these were authorized transfers. I filed the report anyway, spoke to someone polite and tired who explained gently that since I'd willingly sent the money, there was no fraud to investigate. Pursuing anything overseas would cost more than I'd already lost. When the call ended, I sat there holding the phone, feeling smaller than I had in years. That was it. No villain to arrest, no money to recover, no justice to balance the scales, just consequences. I started cutting back immediately. No more pub nights, no meals out, canceled streaming services. Switched to the cheapest groceries, turned the heating down, and wore an extra jumper instead. Each small sacrifice felt like a quiet punishment I was assigning myself. At night, I lay awake replaying her words. You wanted how I made you feel. She was right. I hadn't fallen in love with Maria. I'd fallen in love with the version of myself I became around her. The man who mattered, the man who was needed, the man who could fix problems and change lives. That feeling is intoxicating when you've gone years without it. I obsessed over the signs I'd missed. How every crisis arrived just after I'd settled back into routine. How gratitude always followed money, never preceded it. How affection peaked after transfers and cooled when I hesitated. How she never talked about a future that included sacrifice on her side. I saw it all now painfully clear in hindsight. But hindsight is a cruel teacher. It shows you the answers after the test is over. Weeks passed, then months. I lost weight without trying. Food lost its appeal. Sleep came in short, restless stretches. I found myself staring at walls, zoning out mid-thought like my mind was buffering. Sometimes I'd open Facebook, see a friend request from a stranger, and feel my stomach drop. I stopped accepting them altogether. Eventually, I stopped checking entirely. Trust didn't just disappear, it curdled. Every smile felt suspicious, every compliment felt transactional. Even harmless interactions carried an edge now, like I was waiting for the hidden invoice. I hated that part most. Not the money, but what it did to how I saw people. One evening, while clearing out old photos on my phone, I came across the picture of the van. Bright blue, shiny, Maria and her father smiling like they'd won the lottery. I stared at it for a long time. Then I deleted it. I didn't feel relief. I felt finality. I thought about her children often. Not with resentment, but with a strange sadness. They hadn't chosen any of this. They were growing up in a system where survival blurred moral lines until they were barely visible. That didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained it. Understanding that didn't bring peace, but it stopped the anger from consuming me. I wasn't her victim in the way people like to imagine. I was her opportunity, and opportunities get used. I stopped watching those YouTube channels for a while. The stories hit too close. Everyone sounded like a variation of mine, different details but the same spine. Older men, younger women, distance, money, hope, collapse. Eventually, though, I started listening again, not for validation, for understanding. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. Most of us weren't chasing love. We were chasing relief from feeling invisible, and we were willing to pay almost anything for it. By the time spring rolled around, I'd stabilized financially. Not recovered, but stabilized. I knew what I could afford. I knew what I'd lost. I knew there was no undoing it. Acceptance didn't come all at once. It came quietly, in moments where I realized I'd gone a whole afternoon without thinking about her, where I laughed at something on television and didn't feel guilty for it, where the silence in my flat felt less like an accusation and more like a fact. I wasn't healed, but I was no longer bleeding, and I knew the final reckoning wasn't about money. It was about who I would become after this, whether I'd let shame finish the job loneliness had started, or whether I'd find a way to live with the damage and still remain human. That question followed me into the next phase of my life. One I never planned, but one I had no choice but to face. It's been over a year now. That's the strange thing about time after something like this. It keeps moving whether you're ready or not. Birthdays pass, seasons change, bills arrive on schedule. Life doesn't pause to let you catch your breath or grieve the version of yourself that didn't survive the lesson. I'm 65 years old, and I live alone in the same flat I lived in before all of this happened. Same walls, same kettle, same view out the window. On the surface, nothing looks different, but everything is. In the months after I got back, I thought the worst part would be the money. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a calculator, reworking budgets, adjusting expectations, shrinking my future inch by inch. No big trips, no upgrades, no safety net beyond what I'd salvaged. The numbers were sobering, but manageable. What I didn't expect was how deeply it would change the way I thought about myself. I'd always seen myself as careful, sensible, the sort of man who planned ahead, who didn't gamble, who didn't chase fantasies. That image took a hit I'm not sure will ever fully heal. It's unsettling to realize how thin the line is between responsible adult and desperate fool, and how quickly loneliness can push you across it. For a long time, I replayed her final words in my head. You wanted how I made you feel. At first, that sentence felt cruel. Then, it felt humiliating. Eventually, it started to feel accurate. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. What I wanted wasn't Maria. It was the sense of relevance she gave me, the way my phone lighting up made the day feel less empty, the way her gratitude made my life feel useful again. I'd spent years fading quietly into the background, retired, divorced, no children, no one who depended on me for anything meaningful. She made me feel like I mattered. That's a powerful drug. And like most powerful drugs, it works best when you don't realize you're addicted. I don't hate her. That surprises people when I say it, and honestly, it surprises me too. Hate would be easier. Hate would give the story a clean villain and let me stay firmly in the role of victim. But the truth is messier. She did what she did because it worked, because the system allowed it, because she had children to feed and no moral luxury to turn down an opportunity that presented itself so clearly. I don't excuse her actions, but I understand them enough not to let anger consume what little peace I've rebuilt. If anything, my anger now points inward. Not in a self-destructive way, but in an honest one. I ignored discomfort because it threatened the fantasy. I avoided questions because I didn't want the answers. I mistook consistency for sincerity, attention for affection, and need for love. Those are easy mistakes to make when you're tired of being alone. There were moments afterward when I considered leaving England entirely, starting over somewhere anonymous, a different town, a smaller place, somewhere my past wouldn't follow me so closely. But eventually, I realized that geography wasn't the problem, I was. Running wouldn't fix what needed facing, so I stayed. I rebuilt small routines, morning walks, cooking again instead of reheating whatever was cheapest. Saying yes when Kevin asked me to come down to the pub, even when I didn't feel like talking, especially when I didn't feel like talking. Shame thrives in isolation. I learned that the hard way. Talking about it, carefully, selectively, helped. Not everyone needs the details, most people don't. But admitting that something went wrong, that I misjudged a situation, that I got hurt, took away some of its power. I stopped seeing myself as the man who got scammed and started seeing myself as the man who learned something painful late. That distinction matters. I don't date anymore. Not online, not abroad, not casually. The idea of opening myself up again feels exhausting rather than exciting. That might change one day, or it might not. I've made peace with the uncertainty. What I do know is that I won't use money as a substitute for connection again. I won't confuse generosity with intimacy. I won't let being needed replace being known. Those lessons came at a high price, but they're non-negotiable now. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about Maria, not with longing, but with curiosity. I wonder if the van is still running. If the children are healthy, if she ever feels a flicker of guilt when she thinks of the foreigner who helped her family get back on their feet. Maybe she does. Maybe she doesn't. It doesn't matter. That chapter is closed. What stays with me is the warning embedded in the experience, one I wish someone had drilled into me years ago. Loneliness doesn't announce itself as danger. It presents itself as opportunity. It whispers that you deserve happiness, that it's finally your turn. That taking a risk is brave, not reckless, and when you've been alone long enough, that voice sounds reasonable, convincing even. If you're listening to this story and feeling defensive, thinking, that would never happen to me, I understand. I thought the same thing. I'd read similar stories and shaken my head, convinced I was smarter, more grounded, less vulnerable. I wasn't. None of us are immune when the right combination of timing, need, and attention lines up. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. My life now is quieter than I imagined it would be at this age, but it's also more honest. I don't chase illusions anymore. I don't outsource my self-worth to someone else's affection. I find meaning where I can, small things, ordinary things, things that don't come with strings attached. Some days are still hard. Some mornings the silence presses in a bit too tightly. But I remind myself that peace built on truth, even uncomfortable truth, is better than comfort built on lies. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because I know there's another man somewhere, older, alone, scrolling late at night who thinks a message on a screen might be the start of something that fixes everything. If that's you, I won't tell you to stop dreaming. Just don't confuse dreams with contracts. Don't pay for affection. Don't ignore the questions that make your stomach tighten. And above all, don't mistake being needed for being loved. I paid over $60,000 to learn that lesson. I'm still here, still standing, wiser than I was. And if my mistake can save someone else from making the same one, then at least some good can come from it. That's the version of this story I choose to live with.